Hello, Matrix Live, and welcome. My guest today is Nicholas Gates, Senior Policy Advisor at Open Forum Europe. He's member of the NGI Commons Consortium, and they recently launched the Digital Commons community platform on Matrix. We will cover today what the NGI Commons are and what the Digital Commons community platform are and why they chose Matrix for it. Nick, welcome.
Thank
It's
you.
it,
Yeah, so excited to be here.
it's your first time on Matrix Live. Can
Yeah,
you tell us a bit more about NGI Commons for the few of the people in the audience who wouldn't know already what it is?
only a few. Yeah, so NGI Commons is a coordination and support action from the European Commission funded through Horizon Europe. And it's a project that has multiple partners, including Martel Innovate, Open Future, CNRS, Linux Foundation Europe, and Open Forum Europe, where I'm from. And together we're trying to create a long-term strategy for digital and internet commons in Europe to kind of improve policy coherence, but also investment into the digital commons ecosystem. We have been historically kind of set up to support the Next Generation Internet program. There is some question about the future of the Next Generation Internet program and the projects that it supported over time, though. Really, what we're trying to do is figure out what comes next for digital commons in terms of being front and center on the policy agenda for Europe. And I can talk a little bit more about what we understand digital commons as, because it might be a new concept for some.
Right. Okay. So that's a lot of information. There is a lot to unpack in
Yeah.
that. Fortunately, we have a bit of time for us. But first, who are you, Nick, and what is your role in the consortium?
Sure. So my name is Nick Gates. I'm a policy advisor at Open Europe, where I do pretty much a research and advocacy. At NGI Commons, the project I work on behalf of OFE, I'm much more responsible on the advocacy side. So I'm really involved in our community engagement and awareness raising activities. So I'm doing a lot of reaching out to different initiatives and partners, talking to them and trying to understand their needs. We're kind of documenting different funding and support modalities available to commoners, and we'll be sharing that intelligence by the end of the project. And we're also just doing a lot of community engagement, getting the word out. For example, setting up the platform or the space on Matrix that we'll talk about later.
All right. So first things first, you have mentioned that word a lot already. What is a common and what is a digital or internet common?
Sure. So we've been using the term digital commons lately rather than internet commons, but you can kind of think of them as the same kind of thing. What we understand a digital common as is kind of three elements. So one is the digital resource itself, so kind of the digital artifact and how it's being used. Generally, we think of that as a open or highly open digital artifact. We'll get into the question of open source licensing maybe later. But then it's also the community that surrounds the resource and kind of the dynamics of that community. Is it public interest? What is the community set up to do? How do they work together? And then there's also the question of governance. So what are the actual specific mechanics by which the resource is governed? And is it being done in a way to extract profit, or is it being done in a way to enable co-production? We don't actually have a standard for digital commons right now. So unlike related concepts like digital public goods, there's no operationalized standard or anything that you would consider approaching the open source definition, for example. But it is kind of those three elements in general. And what we're really trying to do is to try and improve our understanding of the last two parts, which are the community and governance dimensions of digital resources and how they're contributing to kind of public interest digitalization. So I think that's the best pitch I can give for digital commons. But yeah, don't think about it as a standard. Think about it as kind of an idea and an ethos. But we're kind of trying to work to figure out what the future looks like and what that actually means in terms of how people understand it as a policy concept and get investment into it, basically. Yeah.
All right. In the introduction, when talking about NGI Commons, you mentioned other NGI initiatives. So off the top of my head, I can think about NGI Zero, NGI Trust, and plenty of others, really. Is NGI Commons related to that? And if yes, how is it related to that?
Sure. So the best way to think about it is that most of what the NGI does is fund technology. But what the NGI is doing in this case is funding a policy initiative. And so those projects are set up through kind of other modalities. What we're set up as a coordination and support action, and that's designed to kind of improve policymaking around digital commons. So there's different ways that many of those projects talk about themselves. Some of them refer to themselves as digital commons. Some of them just think about themselves as open source projects. But it's kind of this panoply or the stable of digital innovations that have been funded over the years by the Commission. And in some cases, they're programs that are set up to fund open source or fund digital commons. But really what we're centered on is kind of the policy side. So we want to improve kind of the long-term future of how those projects are getting funded and supported. Again, as I mentioned before, there's some question in the European Commission's new kind of work program for Horizon Europe about what the future of NGI funding looks like. And so those are open questions that we're navigating as well. But in general, kind of our goal is to improve understanding of digital commons.
All right, so that's I'm going to skip the question I wanted to ask. We're going to get that later, because you mentioned that it's very much centered around policy, and you yourself, you're a senior policy advisor, which is pretty unusual profile in the open source world. So would you say there is a strong interest from policymakers in open source, or are they just trying to figure out what's happening in the open source world?
Sure. So it's really just a handful of organizations that are doing dedicated policy work around open source. Open Forum Europe, where I work, is one of them. There are a number of organizations increasingly, particularly in industry, but also the public sector, where looking at open source policy or digital policy as it affects the open source community is a big part of their job. But really, in terms of being focused on open source policy, we're one of the few. And I would say that it's a niche but increasingly important space. Open source is the foundation of just about every software code base on Earth. It's really kind of crazy, the scale and reach of open source. And so the fact that there isn't as much tension on the policy aspects is kind of surprising. It hasn't been as regulated as you would have thought until the last 5 to 10 years. But in recent years, we've seen the emergence of the Cyber Resilience Act and the EU AI Act, which have explicit provisions for open source. And so this question of like how the open source community comes together to support, provide input to, respond to, understand the effects of those regulations and legislation is a big question. And I think there's a big role for understanding kind of the future of digital commons as kind of providing input to various policy initiatives that are being promoted. And so, digital commons themselves aren't being regulated as such, but open source is being regulated increasingly. So people are having to mobilize and come together to respond to that. And then, we're trying to figure out like what is the role of digital commons in all of that. You might have seen these things like the Eurostack initiative, for example, and those mention the language of digital commons. So we're trying to make sure that what they're actually advocating for does meet the spirit of a commons, and that these initiatives are being kind of maintained and supported as such.
So talking about the Eurostack, can you tell us a bit more about that? What is it?
Sure. So the Eurostack is kind of an independent policy initiative. It's been initiated by Christina Cafara, who is historically a competition lawyer, and Francesca Bria, who now works with Stiftung Mercator and has been a big advocate for getting more funding into the open source ecosystem. What they're trying to do is basically influence the Commission and the European Union to invest more in initiatives that support European digital sovereignty. Their rationale is that the European Union has become too dependent on big tech providers, particularly those from the United States. So through this framing of digital sovereignty, they've kind of proposed this entire kind of range of different prescriptions and policy initiatives, which they think are fundable as part of the work that the Commission is doing. There's a question about kind of what the political uptake of all of that is, but they've released a very detailed report just a couple of weeks ago, which features a number of different policy proposals with different numbers and levels of investment attached to them. And as I mentioned, they do mention open source and digital commons as part of that initiative. So we're trying to figure out what that all looks like.
So you mentioned the digital sovereignty of Europe, but at the same time, open source doesn't really know any border by design because it's well open. Is this a bug or a feature?
It's a good question. I don't necessarily see the two as mutually exclusive. So kind of our role at OFE is to kind of interface between what the Commission is doing and what their priorities are, and then our kind of understanding of what the open source community believes. I'm a big supporter personally of the idea that open source is global. Of course, there is no European open source. But I think what we're trying to figure out is projects that have especially strong connections to Europe or that are going to be utilized in Europe or that are otherwise being kind of regulated by Europe need to, kind of have a consistent approach when it comes to policy coherence and investment from the European Commission. And so we're engaging from that perspective. And the language the Commission is using is around digital sovereignty. And that's an important objective. We have to keep in mind kind of the changing geopolitical context and kind of the factors that are contributing to driving European policymakers towards looking at more digitally sovereign solutions. So I wouldn't say that open source itself is European or anything like that. Open source is a global collaboration. There are communities outside that are working on open source solutions that are being leveraged in Europe, of course, but that's kind of the perspective we bring, is thinking about how European policymakers are approaching all this stuff.
So you mentioned that you were talking to policymakers in terms that they are using at the moment, for example, talking about sovereignty. Can you expand a bit on what NGI Commons is doing to influence the EU policy agenda?
Sure. So we're working on a few things. So we have multiple work packages, as these European projects do, and one of them is focused on kind of creating a strategic agenda for digital commons going forward. In fact, one of my colleagues, Jan from Open Future, he recently released a report which outlines a number of the different policies that have emerged throughout the last 20 to 30 years that are really supporting digital commons or open source. And as you might get a sense of from that report, and we can link to it in the footnotes for this video, I'm sure, there's a lot of different initiatives that have taken place out there. And there's also a lot of initiatives like the Eurostack that are ongoing now. And so we're having to kind of literally work on our feet because there's a lot of stuff happening now as well. But what we're trying to do is make sense of all of those initiatives. And there's many different aspects, whether it's focused on digital sovereignty or competition, and really provide more coherence around what we think that the Commission should do going forward. And so out of all of that, we're doing a lot of sense making and trying to provide recommendations, which, number one, kind of reflect the interests of the community, particularly the NGI community. But then number two, also support getting more investment into the ecosystem.
All right, you mentioned the NGI community. We will get back to that in a minute. But before that, I want to cheekily ask, what are some of the NGI Commons activities that you are working on that are relevant for projects like Matrix?
Sure. One that I'm working on is something called the Commoners Handbook. So the Commoners Handbook is going to hopefully inform the curation of a number of different kind of resources that will basically provide increased understanding to commoner projects about how to access funding or support. So we're speaking to a number of different digital commons projects directly. I'm sure we'll speak to Matrix as well. And basically just talking about kind of their needs and challenges when it comes to sustainability, access to support and funding. And then hopefully we'll be able to provide kind of more direction to those that might be looking to access those resources, but also make sure their opinions and experiences are reflected in the policy work that we're doing. So that's kind of the Commoners Handbook. We're also releasing some research in the next couple of months, hopefully, on kind of a typology of digital commons to provide more understanding of what they are. Maybe it's not language that many open source projects are used to using, but hopefully they might be able to understand the value of thinking about their projects as commons and contributing to public infrastructure projects. So that's also something that we're doing in addition to the policy work. So there's just kind of a range of these different types of engagements that we're trying to do. The core of it for me is trying to understand what are the needs of actual projects? Is there value of thinking of your project in this way? And I think one of the biggest recognitions is just that, open source is important to think about on its own, but thinking about how these projects are being used as part of infrastructure, like Matrix is being used by huge institutions like NATO, right? And so there's a question of what are the obligations to your community and to the governance of your project when you reach that kind of level of scale and usage. And so thinking about commons in that way is something we're trying to encourage the community to do, but also learn from and see kind of where the pushback is and how we can, collectively aspire to more public interest in open technologies.
And so you're working on that sort of toolbox for the commons. One of the weakness that commons have are, well, basically commons are free and anybody can take them and consume them. are there other resources available to support the commons?
Sure, it's a great question. So there are other resources to support the commons, but they're increasingly few and far between. What we're trying to do is make a better case for sustained and continued public funding for commons. There's still a question of what that looks like, or is it funding that focuses more on, core support or maintenance and security, or innovation and scaling up. There's all these questions that we're trying to unpack. But really, we're trying to increase knowledge and awareness of what those challenges are, and then help figure out what the resources that can be directed towards them are. Right now, if you're a Commons project, the best means of support is still your community, which is unfortunate. But you see, even around like Matrix or Blender or any number of these Commons communities, a rallying of support to help sustain these projects, because we recognize that they're very important, but that isn't a sustainable model. And so I'm really interested to see how we can, one, get more public funding, but also public funding isn't reliable. So also create a more diversity of kind of funding sources. I've spoken with really interesting people from the community that are working on projects ranging from like a digital commons kind of library or investment bank, which was kind of, would be governed by the commoners themselves, more associations that would help bring together, private sources of funding and kind of distribute it almost through kind of a foundation or an endowment type structure. And there's a number of different possibilities out there, but I would say that the funding opportunities are limited right now. And, I'm hoping that situation will change in the future, because we want sustained investment to be something that is a priority for digital commons projects. Yeah.
Yeah, and much needed for the sustainability of commons. A lot of your work is listening to, well, people who are actually maintaining the commons. Is
Mhm.
this the reason why you have created the Digital Commons community platform?
Yeah, exactly. I think about my role as part of NGI Commons is really trying to discover new people who are interested in the ideas behind Commons and want to contribute to our policy work. And so going to events like FOSDEM and going to any number of conferences across Europe or even the rest of the world, and meeting new people who are interested in our work is great, but there needs to be a place for those people to come in together and learn about our work, reflect on the issues. So as we were thinking about how to best do that, we looked at a mailing list. We looked at like any number of these different platforms and communities it looked, and Matrix for us was the best example of where to go, because it is a digital commons and there's huge communities that are there. So we kind of trialed it last year, and then we relaunched it around FOSDEM, and since FOSDEM we've grown by like almost half, and so we're really excited to have launched the space. And what we're really just trying to do is create a space for people to connect, and hopefully it'll be a space that can live beyond the life cycle of this project.
All right, so we're going to add a QR code in the video and maybe a link in the description of the video for people to join. But maybe before joining, who should join it and what is discussed there actually?
Sure. So the best thing for me, selfishly, would be if anybody who runs an open source or an open data or open knowledge, open hardware project and is interested in the idea of kind of digital commons and thinking about their project as a commons, or who just wants to learn from other like-minded projects, if you could like register and join, I think that would be a big support for us, because it'll help us identify who's out there listening to us, what their needs are, what's the actual value of thinking in terms of this type of policy language, and what can it actually do in terms of supporting kind of your project, whether it's a small one or a large one. So I think that's the ideal kind of audience I want to reach, is the commoners themselves, but also really just anybody who's interested in open source, open technologies, public interest digitalization, digital government. These are the people that we want on there as well. People who are interested in supporting those projects and the initiatives that support them.
Right. I am in this room, and I could see a few people from a very interesting project being there, and I could see a few very interesting conversations, very relevant to the project, to the problems. We have at the Matrix Foundation. You mentioned that you evaluated several solutions like mailing list, forums, etc., and Matrix stood out as the best platform for that. Why did you pick Matrix for that?
Sure. I mean, there's a huge community of practice that has emerged around Matrix, and it is supporting the work you all do at Matrix and Element. And so I think that was really vital, like having access to those forms of support. Number two was just kind of the, increasing user friendliness of it all. There's a slight challenge in the open source community with developing kind of like user-friendly software and software that works, but there's a real commitment at Matrix to developing something that people can actually use, and increasingly a lot of people are using Matrix. And so that was really exciting. Like we saw kind of a groundswell of support for people moving off proprietary, solutions like Slack and Discord and moving towards things like Matrix. And that was really exciting for us. And it felt very much within the spirit of the project. So yeah, something that was very needed. And yeah, we just are a big fan of the Matrix team. So
All right. Is there anything else you would like the world to know?
yeah, just that, digital commons might not seem like a concept that resonates with how you organically think about your project, but kind of policy language is important, and it's important for thinking about how these communities evolve, grow, and sustain, and what the actual access to and governance of them looks like in terms of the influence on the rest of society. So if you're interested in thinking about your project, not just in terms of how you can keep it alive and how you can support it, but also in terms of what its contribution is to society, I would encourage you to engage more with the concept. There's a lot of different resources out there, some from NGI Commons that are kind of hoping to improve understanding of what the commons are and how we can sustain them. And I think that those would be really good resources for you all to access and learn more. And yeah, if you'd like to support our work or learn how it might advantage you, please get in touch and we can talk, because we want to ensure that digital commons are part of the long-term strategic agenda of the European Commission.
All right. Yes, I was recently talking at PostDem to Amy Parker, who is part of the OpenSSL Foundation and who is a very experienced fundraising person. And she really stressed the importance of having a proper narrative and having a proper mission for a project so that you can raise funds. There is definitely more in open source to just code or people. There are plenty of things that people need to work on, like the governance or being able to articulate properly what problem they are solving actually. And I think the platform is going to be a great place to discuss that and maybe to learn about things you might not be doing properly with others who are doing well, who are more experienced at that. Well, thank you, Nick, and I'll see you next week, Matrix Live.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, look forward to engaging more with the Matrix community. Thank you.